Hello, welcome back. This is Victor Magariño. It's a very cold day today in New York. And what other best moment is there to begin a proper discussion on value and specifically on the Austrian versus the Marxist conception of value. Now I'm going to start a series where I will look at the different arguments put forth by some of the figures in the Austrian School of Economics, because there's differences and there's certainly conflicts even within that School of Economics that we should be aware of. So I'm going to abstract maybe from some of those conflicts, like, well, whether or not there should be decentralized banking and so on and so forth. You know, this Hayek versus Mises conflict there in terms of banking. I'm going to abstract maybe from other conflicts in the Austrian school, but what I want to do is I essentially want to focus this on what are the conflicts with the Austrian school and the Marxist school. And for this, I'm going to make certain videos, some of which will be first a video summary of the text that I'm going to look at. For example, when we look at The Use of Knowledge in Society by Friedrich Hayek, I am going to make that video essay and then do a separate critical analysis of the text. But for some, I'm just going to put everything in the same video, such as with certain critiques of the Marxist labor theory of value. But for now, I want to begin with what are the limitations of this subjectivist notion of value, and why the Marxist analysis of value and of exchange and of competition really gives us a more scientific and more profound insight into, the reality of capitalist society. Now, this is not the first time that I've spoken about value. I've already done so in my last two videos, but I want to do it from a slightly different angle, putting more critical pressure on the Austrian school itself, because so far it's been more of a defense of the Marxist position and of a demonstration of the empirical and formal validity of the labor theory of value. And I want to put the pressure more on the Austrian side by showing a simple exchange that the Austrian school is going to have big trouble in explaining. Let's begin with certain clarifications that I feel need to be taken, because when it comes to speaking about the labor theory of value, there's many misconceptions, and there's people that are going to try to make Marx say things that he wasn't arguing. So let's begin with the basics and then move to this problem that you can use when you debate people on this issue, in order to make them see how there is in fact an objective sense in which we can speak about value and exchange and competition. Now, first I would like to begin by presenting this very simple notion that the labor theory of value applies only to those goods that can be reproduced through the use of labor. So if you're speaking about the market for unique paintings, it is absolutely not going to apply. So the price of those paintings is going to be mainly determined on the willingness of the consumer to pay whichever price they wish to pay or they can pay. But it doesn't apply here. Now, it doesn't apply here because supply, as you can see here, is vertical, using the neoclassical notion of demand and supply. It's vertical. There's only one quantity of that specific painting, and thus price is going to be absolutely determined by demand. Now, Marx accepted this, and this in no sense contradicts the labor theory of value, because the labor theory of value applies to those goods that can be reproducible through labor, and those are the goods that comprise the vast majority of wealth in capitalist societies. So if you want to understand the basic laws, the basic patterns of capitalist economies, you cannot just look at one specific scenario of the paintings, the unique paintings market, and extract from that the conclusion to the rest of the economy. You can't. You need to look at the foundations of competition, of market laws, with reproducible goods and with competition and free movement across sectors. Secondly, it's important to stress a major point, which is that for Marx, use value is a condition for exchange, and it's thus a condition for exchange value and value to exist. So if demand doesn't exist for a given product, the price of that product is basically going to be zero. So you cannot say that Marx didn't take this into consideration, because it is written in the first page of Das Kapital that use values, well, because of being useful, are therefore, well, you can potentially exchange them in the market, and thus something that is not useful can be exchanged in the market, but only if you give people the impression that it's useful. But if people know and understand that there is no use in something, that thing doesn't have value, doesn't have exchange value, doesn't have use value, so therefore use value, even though it's a condition, is not going to be the substance. That's what I'm going to argue here. I'm going to argue that use value and exchange value are of different nature. They are categories of different order. And since this is a very big part of the Marxist argument and of the criticism against the Austrian theory of subjective value, what we're going to focus on now is on justifying this claim. So Marx does this quite nicely in Das Kapital in the first chapter, when he suggests that if you look at the market, you will see that it's full of use values. And use values are by nature heterogeneous. It's not the same a bottle than it's a shirt, than it's a chair or a bed or a window or a, they are heterogeneous by nature. And so are the uses that individual agents extract from those commodities. Because the use of, let's say, a t-shirt might not be the same for me than it might be for somebody else. So there's different use values and there's different utilities that people gain from those use values. Thus, we first encounter a world full of heterogeneity, full of, if you want to call it, chaos. You cannot extract any order from there because utilities cannot be compared because they are subjective. And this is something that the Austrian School of Economics accepts as well. The best you can do, like neoclassical economics do, is establish preference relationships. You cannot have what we call cardinal utility. You can only have ordinal utility. You can order things, but you can never really compare. So if something gives me 2 more utils than you, I cannot say that this is twice as valuable to me as it is for you. You cannot really have this. And this also gets to the point that utility is not quantifiable. You cannot really quantify utility. You can only establish preference relations. However, in a second look at the market, you not only see use values moving from one place to another, but you see them being exchanged against one another. And it is in this exchange that something almost magical occurs, which is that there somehow these heterogeneous use values somehow get compared against one another in terms of how exchangeable they are, in terms of their property of commensurability, right? So now you have commodities that through a given order can be exchanged potentially with every other commodity. Some quantum of commodity X can be exchanged for some quantum of commodity I, and some quantum of commodity I can be exchanged for some quantum of commodity Z. Therefore, what in principle happens is that you can exchange any given commodity for any other proportion of any other commodity. So this property of commensurability is already an observed fact that we can see in a market that before seemed to us as just use values being moved around, and now they are exchanged, and there's certain laws governing that exchange, which is what Marxists are going to focus on, because from that analysis of exchange you get that labor is the source of value, and if you accept this basic principle, then it is inescapable that surplus value is unpaid labor. This being the reason why bourgeois economists, like the ones in the Austrian school, have been so eager in their attempt to, ignore this and to try to refute this argument, because they know and they understand that the logical conclusion from it is that surplus value is unpaid labor, and whether you want to call it exploitation or whatever you want to call it, this is something that can lead, following even further the logical chain, to, well, the law of the falling rate of profit, etc. Also notice that in societies where money appears into the picture, now exchange value is expressed as a quantum of that money, and thus exchange value now becomes what you can call price, monetary price. But originally it was just, through which proportion can you exchange this commodity for this other commodity for that other commodity. But if you introduce money into the picture, it doesn't change the picture. It's just saying, well, money of course plays its important role in all of this, but for now the analysis is just money now becomes, well, something in which you can express exchange value. And these prices, we're going to argue, are objective. Everyone in the market faces the same price. Now, this is not, again, the neoclassical argument of there's only one price, so that when you look at the data and you see that for the same commodity there's different prices, you don't know how to explain this. Now, for the Marxist economists, and also in the classical tradition, there was a tendency towards a single price, but this didn't mean that every single commodity, similar commodity or equal commodity, must be exchanged at that particular price. It just said that this is the tendency, and if you look at the data, you'll see that it looks like a normal distribution. And therefore, this does not in any sense contradict the Marxist theory of exchange and of prices. It, on the other hand, contradicts the neoclassical theory that suggests that there will only be one price and that this price will be immediately enforced. For the Marxist, it's a process, because everything in capitalism is a process. Capital, for example, is a process. So what I mean when I say that everyone in the market faces the same price is not that they literally all sell for the same commodity, that they not all sell at the same price, but on the other hand, that there's this tendency to have this single price because those that sell, well, the margin between their cost and their price is very wide. Those are going to tend to be outcompete by those who sell below that price that the ones that have a very wide margin are selling at. And thus there's this tendency. Now, it doesn't mean, again, that they will literally all sell at the same price at any given point in time, but that there will be, it's a tendential mechanism. Like many other mechanisms in Marxist economics, work in a similar fashion. So then again, we began with a situation where we had use values and utilities which exist in the realm of the subjective, and now we are beginning to understand how through competition objectivity is imposed in the market. And this is basically how it works. If I'm a producer of good X and the market price of that good is, let's say, $10, no matter whether or not my subjective valuation of that good might be $30, but if the market price is 10 and I am selling it at 30, what will most likely happen is that consumers will buy the most inexpensive one of those goods, which will put me out of business. Therefore, there's this objectivity that is imposed through competition. Whether, again, we saw that use values and utility is subjective, and now we see that exchange value obeys certain laws and that it's objective. Everyone faces this same price. So what we can see is that there is no convergence in the case of utility towards a given common mean. There isn't a social common mean of utility. However, we see that commodities get exchanged objectively ones against the others. So there is some mean there that these commodities are tending towards, and we want to explain why. What is that mean and how does it arise? What is the source of that mean? So now that we have spoken about all of this, we can actually get to the example that is going to suggest to us what are the well, were the shortcomings of the Austrian analysis of value. So let's imagine that in the economy there's two sectors. There's a sector that produces deer meat and the other one that produces oranges. And let's imagine that a single producer from the deer meat sector wants to have oranges for some reason that day. Let's imagine that a kilogram of oranges takes the same amount of labor time to be produced as 1 kilogram of meat. Thus, what the Marxists and the classicals were going to say is that the proportion through which they're going to exchange in the market is the ratio is going to be equal to the ratio of the labor times that they take. So imagine that the price of 1 kilogram of oranges is $10, and then a price of a kilogram of deer meat is also $10. So the deer hunter has spent 10 hours hunting 1 kilogram of deer meat and goes into the market and exchanges it for 1 kilogram of oranges, because he gained $10 from selling it and then spent it in that. So then we have an exchange in which both the deer hunter and, assuming that the orange producer also bought was the one that actually bought that 1 kilogram of deer meat, so that they both, when exchange occurs, gain from that exchange, because the deer hunter wanted a kilogram of oranges and the orange producer wanted a kilogram of deer meat. Therefore, aggregate utility after that exchange has increased, and yet the amount of exchange value that they have hasn't changed. Why? Because they still have with them a commodity that is worth $10. 1 kilogram of meat and 1 kilogram of oranges, still worth $10, and yet aggregate utility has increased after that exchange. Therefore, we can see that utility and exchange value don't move in a parallel fashion. And this is precisely because utility, again, is subjective. Utility can only be, in a sense, ordered in this preference scale. However, exchange value is objective, and it arises from competition in the market, because producers, once they start competing, take into consideration their costs. So then this becomes a problem for those that argue that utility is the source of value, because aggregate value has stayed the same, whereas aggregate utility has increased. Therefore, the source of value has to be something else, and it has to be something quantifiable, because exchange, the proportion to which you can exchange a commodity for another commodity, is also quantifiable, and utility isn't. Utility isn't comparable, isn't quantifiable, it is subjective, therefore it lives in a different dimension. Analytically, it's different. It's completely different to exchange value, and surely to value, which is, for the Marxists, labor, abstract, socially necessary labor time. And this is what endues the social substance of value. And again, this is not like people are asking when they purchase something, how much labor time did this take you, so that I can compare it with this other producer and I can know. This is something that happens objectively from the side of supply, because once there's competition, producers care about their costs, because if they sell at a margin that it's very wide, someone is very likely going to sell at a lower margin, and thus is going to take all of the clients, thereby putting them out of business. So this is a very simple exchange that a Marxist could perfectly well explain, because the Marxist, first of all, understands that use value is a condition for exchange, and therefore, since both producers found use in whatever they were gaining from that exchange, use value as a condition was fulfilled. And yet the Marxist is not running into this problem where, well, if utility has increased, aggregate utility, then why has value remained the same? Because for the Marxists, what allowed for that equal exchange was precisely the fact that both producers took the same amount of time to produce that kilogram of meat on the one hand and of oranges on the other hand. And to prove and to show how this is the mechanism that allows for this unique exchange value, let's look at what would happen under specific circumstances. So first, let's imagine that preferences change. So let's look at a situation where, for example, people value less meat, they become vegetarian, and they start to value more oranges. So now, with the initial quantity supplied, there is going to be a higher price at which, if playing the same, supply and demand game, there's going to be a higher price now for oranges and a lower price for deer, because there's going to be a lot more demand coming into the market of oranges relative to the market of deer. But it still takes 10 hours to produce 1 kilogram of meat and of oranges. So then what this situation is going to tell us, that in this period, the ones that are selling the oranges are actually gaining these extra profits, and thus for the same amount of labor time, and thus the producers in the deer sector are going to increase their rate of moving to that orange sector to the extent where they saturate that market and they reduce, because supply now is going to grow faster than demand in that market, they start to reduce that price until both prices, again, the ratio between those prices becomes equal to the ratio of their labor times. And this is the mechanism. And the Austrians yet don't have this mechanism. For them, the first period in which quantities change, the prices and the quantities change because demand preferences have changed, for them that's it, that's the entire story. But for the Marxist, once supply accommodates the new demand, what these preferences are going to tell you is only the quantity of goods in that sector that is being sold, but it's not going to tell you the price. It's not going to explain exchange value. Exchange value needs to be explained through something else, and as we have seen in this simple logic, it is labor, direct and indirect labor time, abstract socially necessary direct and indirect labor time, that brings about this natural price, and market prices are going to be fluctuating around this natural price, as we just saw with this example. So then again, we have this subjectivist notion of value that accepts that value is subjective, and yet when it comes to facing the reality of the objectivity of exchange values, seems to not be able to accept this reality and to just accept it under very specific circumstances. And this is not the only thing, because preferences also change with prices, which is in a sense reversing the causation of this subjectivist notion that prices are caused by preferences. But preference also change with prices. Therefore, the analysis of the subjectivists in with respects to value is single-minded. It only looks at a very particular aspect, utility, and it ignores everything else. And the reason for this is because if you only look at utility, it seems just as if people just decide subjectively the prices in that economy and everyone gains from commerce, and this all fits very nicely the narrative of the political narrative of the bourgeoisie of accept the statu quo and don't criticize, don't look at surplus value, don't look at anything else because we already have everything figured out. Well, it's not the case. Things are more complicated than that, and a proper scientific study of economics requires you to examine thoroughly and fully every analytical stage possible. And this is what Marx did. And this is why we have a more complete analysis of the situation, where we just don't go and say, well, aggregate utility has gone up. And what about value? Value has remained the same. How can you explain that? Well, we can, and yet the Austrians are going to have big trouble in doing this. So this is it for now. I hope you like this video. You can support me by subscribing, liking, and all of those wonderful things. I will see you in the next video.